So, hello everyone. At the moment, Christian Morris TV is experiencing technical difficulties. Now, if that was the BBC in the 1970s, they would have put on a few back episodes of Mr. Ben or that kind of thing, or the Magic Roundabout. But unfortunately, I don't have access to such archives. So, what I've done instead is I've just recorded this particular video separately using my desktop microphone and separately with my sound recording software, which I have then imposed over a PowerPoint presentation. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that a PowerPoint presentation can be saved in video file format. And although it's not sophisticated video software, PowerPoint is the equivalent, really, of a sledgehammer. And you try being on a building site or any kind of major job and you don't have a sledgehammer and you see how cool it is. So, the fact that PowerPoint is crude and many people misuse it a lot of the time, the way many people misuse sledgehammers, doesn't mean in its own right that PowerPoint is a bad program. It's just a lot of the people who employ PowerPoint are bad users. So this particular video that you're watching was rendered and edited and finished completely in PowerPoint. Anyway, I'm not a solicitor, I'm not a barrister, I'm not in any way competent to give legal advice to anyone, but I have taken a look at the Statutory Instrument SI, Statutory Instrument number 296 of 2020. That is the legislation that governs, allegedly, the criminalising of people who decide not to wear masks in shops. We'll talk about that in a second. But something that's popped up more recently is the function in the Station House Hotel in Clifton and Connemara in County Galway in Ireland, in which 80 or so members of the Oireachtas, senators and members of the Dáil, had a hoolie for the Oireachtas Golf Society, and in which they completely flouted all of the social distancing rules. Now, some of these people are coming out with apologies, which are bullshit, and some of them are being like Phil Hogan. People don't seem to realise, or many people who vote for Fine Gael don't realise, that Phil Hogan is a wanker. Alan Kelly is a wanker as well. And we have a lot of these bombastic, culty wankers in the Dáil. Or like Phil Hogan, who's moved on to the European gravy train. And he's completely unapologetic for what happened, and he is doing the typical Phil Hogan routine of blustering his way through things. Phil Hogan is a lout. There is a credible story, if you look in Google and look back a few years, of Phil Hogan making unpleasant remarks to women at these various different functions he goes to. Now, I don't know how tired and emotional he might be at these particular functions, or how thirsty he might have been in advance. But certainly, Phil Hogan is not a nice man. But, you know, he's typical Fine Gael. He's arrogant, he's blustering, he's a bully, he's full of shit, he's absolutely the epitome of modern Fine Gael. Fine Gael wasn't always... Fine Gael was never a nice party. They were never nice people. You know, their background is in fascism. They didn't write the constitution at this state. They didn't set up the courts, the Senate, the Dáil, the presidency. They didn't create all of those essential checks and balances that we have here in the Republic of Ireland. So they'd resent it, and they know they didn't create it. And, you know, this is why, since they took power in 2011, Fine Gael have tried to drive a sledgehammer through very long established and extremely important constitutional protections that we enjoy here. One of them was when they tried to get rid of the Senate, but even more invidious and insidious was their efforts to allow Oireachtas committees to make findings of fact. Fortunately, we rejected that in a referendum. Hopefully we will continue to do so. Because under Irish constitutional law and under very strict precedent here, the only person or group of people who can make a finding of fact against you is a court. So that's a judge or a panel of judges or a jury under a judge in a court in Ireland. So what Fine Gael wanted to do was create Dáil courts. That's what they want. That's it, literally. That's not an exaggeration. They wanted to create political courts run by politicians like Simon Harris. Excuse me. Yes, Simon Harris is in the studio with me here today. I can smell him. Well, my cigarette smoke doesn't even smell as bad as fucking Simon Harris. But anyway, Simon Harris and Helen McEntee, Daddy's girl. I once asked Helen McEntee that if I convinced my father to commit suicide, would I get a seat in the Dáil? She never replied, but she blocked me. So we have luminaries like that crook Alan Farrell, insurance fraudster Alan Farrell. We've wonderful people in the Dáil and in the Seanad. Catherine Noone. Oh, there's such fabulous, fabulous guiding lights of excellence like Catherine Noone in the Seanad. I don't want those kind of people to be in a position to make permanent findings of fact against me or anyone else. And this ties into a bigger thing. It's a cliche to say that you have to be willing to fight for the right of your enemy to express themselves as much as you can, but that's the truth. I'm not a Christian, but at the same time I very much supported John Waters this day last week and the people who went to Knock Basilica, despite the fact that they were told not to and that there were police there and all the rest of it. They went and they defied them and they won. And John Waters gave a great speech in Knock, and what was so good about it, and if you look at the video of John Waters in Knock, what was so good was that it wasn't attended by cranks or freetards, and those fuckers always latch on to legitimate movements. I mean, that happened with the Irish water protest movement, where Direct Democracy Ireland, all these other retards, were giving people false legal advice. Civil disobedience carries a cost. If you decide that you're going to take on the system, okay, you're not going to be violent, you're not going to riot, you're not going to loot, you're not going to go to protests, fair enough. But when you decide to take on the system, you could be prosecuted for, say, refusing to pay a water bill or refusing to pay a TV licence. And what Direct Democracy Ireland was advising people to do was to take the Irish water bills and write no contract, no consent, return to sender, and send them back to Irish Water. And the reason why that was false legal advice, which would cause harm to people, is because it would then prove to Irish Water that you had been served with the bill. Whereas I was advising people, when they got their Irish water bills, to burn them. Because if they're burnt, it's a lot harder to go into court and prove service of a pile of fucking ash. But no, Direct Democracy Ireland are advising people, no contract, no consent, return to sender. Now, the kind of people who would believe that kind of thing deserve whatever they get. Ultimately, with the Irish water boycott, it won. The Irish water boycott won, and we, the people, faced down this disgusting Fine Gael gravy train full of cretins like John Tierney. That Irish water was. But that doesn't mean the battle is over. The battle is not over. So civil disobedience means burning your Irish water bill, burning your RTE TV licence. But if you do things like that, you are liable to prosecution. And one of the things then that the freetards and Direct Democracy Ireland come out with, Ben Gilroy in particular, that fucker Ben Gilroy, they're not legitimate courts. They're de facto courts. Well, you go into the High Court and say that it's a de facto court, and you see what a warm Kate Míle you'll get from any judge of the High Court. You have to recognise the court system. You have to recognise the law. And this ties back to the statutory instrument number 296 of 2020, which is the law in relation to allegedly having to wear face masks in shops. So the fact that it is secondary legislation, in other words, it was not passed by a vote of the Dáil or the Seanad and signed by the President, it's delegated secondary legislation. That does not mean that it's unconstitutional, and that does not mean that it does not apply to you. It does apply to you, because in the Irish system, as in the British system, ministers are given delegated powers to bring through what are called statutory instruments, and they're law. They're enforceable law. Now, you're always entitled to bring an action in the High Court to challenge the constitutionality of a statutory instrument. But until you do so, it is constitutional, because that's the way the system works. Everything is presumed to be constitutional until you prove it not constitutional. So we have to assume that statutory instrument SI number 296 of 2020, that's constitutional. It stands. But then when you read into it, that's where the people who have more than two brain cells are able to actually work out how to get around shit like this. And when you look at it, the most important feature of the requirement, what's called the requirement to wear a face covering, is that you have the right to claim a reasonable excuse if wearing a face covering causes you severe distress. Now, reading further into the statutory instrument, it does not say that anybody who goes into a shop or a supermarket or wherever and says that they suffer from severe distress by wearing a face mask, they don't have to prove it. They're not required to show a doctor's certificate. And it is wrong for anybody in a shop to demand evidence from somebody that they have a reasonable excuse. That is harassment. If you are claiming that you have a reasonable excuse, and if the statutory instrument does not state that you have to prove it, well then the burden of proof on you is only up to you telling somebody. Beyond that, they have to believe you. They are obliged to believe you, because don't forget, a person has the right to a presumption of innocence over guilt. So let's say you go into a supermarket and some busybody stops you and says, I require you to wear a mask. You need only say, well, I suffer from severe distress from doing so. Well, I require to see a doctor's certificate. No. I don't have to show you anything. You have to take my word for it. And that's the proper response to it. And if they carry on with that, call the guards. Call the Gardaí down and let them argue with the Gardaí. This, of course, refers to supermarket staff. If any member of the public demands why you're not wearing a mask, they can ask my arse, if I condescend to even answer them. And this then ties into something else. What we've seen with the golf bash down in the Station House Hotel in Clifton is that, in fact, people are being made a mockery of. And now these people who were tricked into burlesquing themselves through a ritual of wearing muzzles, as Peter Hitchens so correctly describes them, are now discovering that they were made a fool of. I was not made a fool of, because as of March this year, I have refused to wear a mask. I also wrote to Garda Assistant Commissioner Anne-Marie Cagney, who's the Chief of Police for the Greater Dublin Metropolitan Area, and I told her in no uncertain terms that I would not at any time be wearing a muzzle or a mask. In my letter, I wanted to be helpful, because you should always be courteous to the police. Always be courteous to the police. And I told her, I gave her the contact details of a solicitor if I'm arrested. So I've got my ass covered with that particular one. Funnily enough, nobody has arrested me yet. I haven't even been apprehended by the Gardaí. But, you know, it's important to have all the corners covered. So, I haven't been made a fool of by these psychopathic, cretinous politicians, but the people who are going around Nolan's Supermarket in Clontarf, or indeed the management of Nolan's Supermarket in Clontarf, who come out with these really horribly toned and worded notes, you know, that are written in capital letters. Writing in capital letters and writing in red is a sign of mental illness. But it's hard to know with Nolan's Supermarket whether the mental illness is the proprietors or the customers. Maybe it's probably an equal share of both. But Nolan's Supermarket have these horribly toned and horribly worded messages, you know, and they're written in capitals with red, which is the literal, the reading equivalent of being shouted at. Well, I don't care, because they can fuck right off, and I'm not going to their shithole of a supermarket. I found other supermarkets I've gone to, SuperValue in Sutton, were extremely courteous to me and were extremely sympathetic and made it clear that they disapproved of and would not tolerate customers harassing anybody who's claiming an exemption. You do not have to answer to any customer or any wanker who walks up to you in the street and says, "Why are you not wearing a mask?" And I find a good answer to these people is, "Sorry, I can't hear you because you've covered your mouth." That works. There are other answers I could give to them as well, but, you know, I don't want to be arrested for other offences. So I find just telling these kind of losers to just, you know, or fuck off is a good one as well. I find fuck off, you can't go wrong with that particular one. But the reality is, and it's more serious, that an awful lot of people in this country have been made fools of. They chose to. They chose to wear a mask. Because if you read the statutory instrument correctly, the defence of reasonable, the reasonable excuse defence of severe distress can apply to anybody. In my case, it applies genuinely, because I would be very severely distressed by being forced to wear a muzzle. That's not a joke. I'm not raising that as a falsehood. I'm not raising that. I'm very serious about that. I'm not going to wear a mask. You know, it would cause me very severe distress. So I have a defence under this statutory instrument. However, those people who have worn masks, now, they're rather like those cretinous people from a town a few miles or kilometres north of Balbriggan, who sent their Irish water bills back saying no consent, no contract, no consent, return to sender. I'm sure they had difficulty writing that because of, obviously, their literacy problems. But anyway, those people who sent those bills back to Irish Water cannot subsequently, after that event, claim that they didn't know. And those people who've chosen to wear face masks or muzzles or whatever the fuck you want to call it to a supermarket cannot then subsequently say, well, I have a defence, I have a reasonable excuse of severe distress. So they have to keep wearing their masks, don't they? Because if they don't wear their masks now and they're apprehended by the Gardaí, they cannot, the charge that could be brought against them, and it would be a stateable claim by the prosecution is, well, you were able to wear it last week when you were coming in buying your vegan quinola. So, what's the big change this week? Whereas I've always consistently said, I am not wearing a mask. Start of, middle and end, I am not wearing a mask. So, I cannot be accused of changing my position. Whereas, the people who are coming in their clogs and, their caftans to Nolan's supermarket in Clontarf to buy all their vegan soy 57 gender pretend bacon, who were wearing a mask for the past 2 weeks and who then decide that it might cause some severe distress, they cannot claim that legal indemnity. So this ties into a bigger picture that you never give a sucker an even break. Anybody who knows how the Irish government works knows that that's the most consistent feature of the Irish government, that they never give a sucker an even break. The people who chose to wear masks, and they chose to wear masks. They wore their masks to Nolan's supermarket, and they wore their mask to Ranelagh transgender farmers market. They chose to wear their masks, and they have to stick with it. They were suckers. And they have been made a fool of by those 80 or so scumbags who went down to that hotel, the Station House Hotel in Clifton in Galway. They have been made a fool of, and they are being mocked. They're being laughed at now. And they're also being laughed at by me.